Today we're going to continue our look at rationalism after World War I. And this is really the origins of modern architecture that we recognize as being modern. And in past lectures, we've taken a look at a couple of the earlier figures of this movement. And today we'll take a look at a couple of others, specifically Ricard Neutra and the Lovell Health House in Los Angeles, and Giuseppe Terragni and the Casa del Fascio in Como. In addition, we'll look at the exhibit held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1932. And it was that exhibit that gave us the title International Modernism, as well as defining what that modernism was. And so we'll take a look at that. And this will give us a vocabulary term as well as the characteristics that we associate with it that I will use going forward, and that will allow me to refer back to it and then take a look at the way in which other designers developed upon international modernism. Let's start with Ricard Neutra. Neutra was born in Vienna, and he studied architecture, first of all, at the Technical Institute in Vienna, and then he enrolled in a private architecture school that was founded and run by Adolf Loos. Now, from an earlier lecture, you may remember that Adolf Loos was the Austrian designer who wrote an article entitled Ornament and Crime. And it was due to that article that we get the idea that a modern architecture will have no ornament, no decoration, no detail other than what is required to hold the building together. And so, because Neutra studied at Loos's architecture school, we can understand that he knew what it was that Loos was proposing. And we're going to see that Neutra also has no decoration, no applied ornament in his architecture. Neutra served in World War I, and he assumed a variety of positions in Austria after the war. But in 1923, he emigrated to the United States. He worked briefly in an office with Frank Lloyd Wright. And pretty soon after that, he launched his own career in the Los Angeles area. His first major commission was a house, a residence, for this man, Dr. Philip Lovell. Lovell was a trained physician, and he also made a career for himself, promoting his own ideas about physical well-being and health, and publishing in the local newspaper. Lovell's ideas are what we today might call naturopathic ideas, or a naturopathic approach to medicine. He believed that well-being and health resulted from healthful living. And he defined healthful living as a raw food diet, having plenty of sunshine and fresh air and exercise. And in general, he's looking to maintain well-being and healthiness rather than having to treat illness. When it became necessary to treat illness, he's going to investigate drugless remedies, trying to avoid pharmaceuticals, trying to avoid chemicals to the extent possible, but really at base, trying to avoid problems to begin with. He had some ideas about his house, and in a later interview, he described what it was that he had spoken to Neutra about for the building that we'll be taking a look at. He said, "We need and want sun, air, harmony of lines, and the ability to do many healthy things which I advocate, such as sleeping outdoors, nude sunbathing, a pool that was never chlorinated, light, air, sunshine, clean lines, no hodgepodge of ideas." So some of the things from that quote are just basic naturopathic ideas that Lovell proposed. But some of them become architectural criteria that we're going to see Neutra accommodating in the design of the house. First of all, harmony of lines. Secondly, clean lines, which might be pretty much the same thing. And then lastly, no hodgepodge of ideas, whatever that means. We'll take a look at all of these when we get into the architecture of the house. The site that Dr. Lovell had purchased in Los Angeles has a number of challenges to it. First of all, it's very steeply sloping, and the high point of the site is right at street level. There's not a lot of area that is at that level before it begins descending very quickly. And so this is going to be a bit of a problem because the house has to accommodate that change in elevation. But it's also providing an opportunity because as the site slopes away, there are views that open up of the city of Los Angeles beyond. Another site condition that was a challenge was the soil. Like many of the hills in Los Angeles, bedrock is not close to the surface. What we're looking at basically is just a lot of dirt piled up. And that becomes a problem if you're trying to build on it. And we'll take a look at ways in which Neutra accommodates all of these things in the design. But let's start with the slope and how Neutra is going to actually occupy the site. Well, at the uppermost part of the site, which again is closest to the street, and that's the level that we're looking at in the image to the upper right here, very close to street, the location of the street and at street level is the primary entrance into the house. When you enter into the house, there's an entry area, and from that entry area, you have access to the doctor's offices. He ran his practice in part out of the house. But it's also at this level that there are the primary bedrooms for the occupants of the house. But from that entry area, you also have access to the vertical circulation, which will take you down 2 stories to the private parts of the house. That circulation area has a lot of direct sunlight coming in from the glass and steel curtain wall that you can see here. And a large staircase brings you down to the primary living area, which again is 1 floor level below the entry, the offices, and the bedrooms. And here, if we take a look at the plan, in the plan you can identify where the staircase is, you can identify where the fireplace is, and horizontally in the plan is where the living area is, close to the fireplace. And then going sort of perpendicular from that in the corner, in the left-hand side of the plan, you can get into the dining room, which connects to the kitchen, which is sort of tucked between the living room and the dining room there in the plan. And in the plan to the upper right, you might see some smaller spaces that appear to be more enclosed. Those are guest rooms. And so guests who were here would have their own private bedrooms as well as closets and bathrooms. From this level, you could descend once again, and there would be mechanical spaces, there would be some utility rooms, but you'd also be able to exit the building and access an area which is by the pool. And from these images, you can see that there were some areas by the pool which were outside but still covered by the house. But then the pool extends out and the terrace around the pool extends out so that you could actually be in the open air by the pool without being covered by the rest of the house. So basically the way that Neutra is going to accommodate the function on the site is by descending and by putting different floor levels and becoming, in a way, increasingly private as you descend the topography. Now, in terms of functional spaces, there are a couple of things that I'd like to point out that were areas that Neutra added or developed in particular ways in order to functionally fulfill some of the things that Dr. Lovell was proposing. Connected to every bedroom, there were outdoor sleeping areas. today enclosed in glass, but you'd be able to open the windows and you'd be able to have as much fresh air in your outdoor sleeping area as you would want. And that was one of the naturopathic ideas that Dr. Lovell promoted. Dr. Lovell also promoted a raw food diet, and he had some very specific ideas about what we need to do to food, if anything at all. And Neutra accommodated all of that in the kitchen. There were some utilities, there were some appliances that at the time were the most up-to-date that he accommodated. When we look at the kitchen, it might look a little dated, but for the 1920s, this was really top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art technology in the kitchen in order to promote the raw food diet that Dr. Lovell advocated. Now, when we take a look at the architecture, the design of the different spaces, we're going to see a number of ways in which Neutra gave form to what it was that Lovell was advocating. Obviously, the house exists on 3 different levels, but once you get to each level, generally speaking, you're going to encounter a flat floor surface. And so once you get to the living area, between the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, it's all going to be on the same floor level. This was intended to decrease the exertion that you need to spend inhabiting the house. So that was one way in which Neutra is going to meet what it is that Lovell requires. In the living area, you're also going to see that there is a relatively low and flat ceiling. And this was with acoustics in mind. Dr. Lovell wanted to reduce the amount of strain on the ear, and they believed that by having low ceilings, someone's speaking voice is going to be able to reverberate and to be heard clearly. And so low ceilings and flat ceilings were going to reduce the strain on the ear. Eye strain was also going to be something that Dr. Lovell was concerned about, and Neutra is going to reduce that by having a clear geometry, a simple geometry, an identifiable geometry, clean straight lines, like Dr. Lovell was going to call for. Light was going to be important. In some areas, we're going to have direct sunlight streaming in through all of the glass. In other areas, the light is going to be filtered, and we can also see that there is indirect artificial lighting. In the 1920s, they were still getting their heads around what electrical light was like, and it was becoming clear to everyone that with the developments in electrical lighting, that you really could create some very unpleasant spaces with some of the new lighting that was available. And so here we can see that when there is artificial lighting, it's largely going to be indirect, and in that way save eye strain. And furthermore, there's the color palette. Throughout the house, we're going to see off-whites and creams and light grays, all of which were intended to be soothing on the eyes. So in all of these different ways, we can see Neutra accommodating Lovell's needs for the house and accommodating what it was that Lovell was advocating. The site itself, despite all of the challenges, is going to be fairly large. And over the years, there are going to be a number of ways in which Neutra is going to add things to the site in order to accommodate Lovell and also his growing family. There are going to be tennis courts. There are going to be terraces. There's going to be a children's theater built on the site. There's also going to be a garage and then a study for Dr. Lovell built under the garage. So all of these things are going to be added, but the site itself is going to be a bit of an issue. And it's going to be interesting to take a look at the structural system that Lovell used, that Neutra used for the house, and see how it is that they actually occupied such a challenging site. The structure of the house is a point load system of steel construction. Neutra, and I imagine an engineer, designed the structural system in advance and shipped the specifications off to a manufacturer. And so once the site was prepared with pour-in-place reinforced concrete foundation walls, the manufacturer was able to ship the steel to the site and to build the structure very quickly. As a matter of fact, from the moment the steel shipment arrived on the site until the steel structure was completed, all of that was done from arrival to completion in 40 hours. Now, in 2025, that would have been outstanding, right? The idea that you're going to put all of this steel together in just 40 hours, that's unusual today. If you think back to the 1920s, when this was still relatively new technology, you can understand just how outstanding that was. Practically unheard of, right? But this is also going to be the first example, or what's purported to be the first example in American residential architecture, of a house that is completely supported structurally by steel. This is the first steel frame house in the United States. This was also tied into how Neutra was going to address some of the site conditions. Again, steeply sloping hillside of soil, not bedrock. And by building these foundation walls of poured-in-place reinforced concrete and then setting up the steel structure on top of it, that's how Neutra is going to structurally support the building despite all of the challenges of the site. But then we have the enclosure of this structural system. And if we take a look at the building, we're going to see that there is a lot of glass curtain wall that is here. But also we've got some wall areas, mostly at the lower parts of the walls beneath the continuous windows. And here again we can see new technology being used. There was steel mesh that was attached onto the steel structure. On the inside of the steel mesh there would be insulating panels, and then onto the steel mesh there would be blown concrete. And then the concrete would be smoothed over and painted white. And the result is that we have these smooth areas of a white material that is hard to identify. We don't exactly know what it is. It doesn't appear to be massive. Where we do get a look at the thickness, considering the extent of it, it does appear to be relatively thin. And so whether it's the structure or whether it is the enclosing material, we can see new materials, new technology in the design of this house. All of this is going to really be an unprecedented example of this new modern architecture being used in residential architecture in the United States. And this is going to give Neutra not only a great opportunity to explore his own ideas about architecture, but also to expand on his developing concept of what architecture is able to do. Over the years, Neutra is going to develop an approach to design that he called biorealism. If we wanted to define biorealism, we could call it physiology and psychology informing architecture. Okay? Physiology and psychology informing architecture. Well, Neutra was an architect, but how did he learn about physiology and psychology? Well, Neutra's older brother was a doctor, and they were both living in the family house when his older brother was going through medical school, when he was studying. And so Neutra saw what his brother was doing. He had an interest in it, and he sort of, from a distance, followed the courses and the learning, the knowledge that his brother was accumulating. So he had some exposure to the human body and how it operates. In terms of psychology, the Neutras, back in Vienna, were family friends with the Freuds. And so Sigmund Freud and his family would often get together with the Neutras. As a matter of fact, Richard Neutra's, one of his buddies from his school days, was Sigmund Freud's son, and they would often go on school trips together and go traveling together. And so there was a close family relationship. Now, psychology as a discipline was really developing in the 1890s, the 1900s, and Neutra had a privileged position with which to watch this discipline be formed and begin to be structured. He was able to watch Freud, and through the family interaction, he was able to see some of the things that Freud was beginning to do and how he was beginning to develop his practice. And with this, he understood some points about psychology. Furthermore, Neutra's older brother, the doctor, made a career for himself studying the physical outcome of psychological problems. And so, from all of these family connections, personal connections, we can see that Richard Neutra, the architect, had some insight into the human body physiology and also psychology. And with this, he was going to approach architecture a bit differently. He understood, as many people did, that environments can be harmful to human beings. With the Industrial Revolution, it was very clear that pollution could be harmful to human beings. It was very clear that you needed clean drinking water, fresh air to live well. But with some of the developments of technology and with mass transportation and electrical lighting and cities that are functioning 24/7, it also became apparent that the noise and the constant light could produce environments that were not healthy for people. And so Neutra is beginning to understand that architects have the capability of using their knowledge to design environments that are going to be better for people, that are going to promote well-being and shield them from some of the problems that I just mentioned here. And so he wanted to apply knowledge from physiology and psychology to architecture. And there are a few different things that he's going to focus on. First of all, he wants to control stimuli. Understanding that all of the light and noise that we get with the modern city is going to be harmful. He wants to design buildings where, one way or the other, the stimuli are going to be controlled. Now, this might include soundproofing and darkening shades, but it's also going to include those calming colors in the palette of the interior. It's going to include how you deal with light, whether it's natural light or whether it's artificial light. It's also going to include the lines that are visible in the geometry of the building and of the spaces, things that we've already encountered in the Lovell House. Secondly, he's going to focus on a connection with nature. It had long been understood that human beings need some sort of visual connection to green space and plants, and humans also need a connection with non-urban settings in order to be healthy. And Neutra is going to look for ways in his architecture in which he can maximize that connection with nature to the extent possible. And then thirdly, he's going to advocate meeting the individual needs of the client. And in this way, the architect is going to have to be a sort of investigator or practitioner, in which the architect has to figure out what it is that the individual client really needs, and this is Neutra's word, diagnose the architectural need of the client. So acting like a doctor, even though he's an architect. Neutra is going to make all of these ideas known through a number of publications, one of the most important of which was a book entitled Survival Through Design, which he published in 1954. So kind of an interesting title, Survival Through Design, as if human beings are kind of on the brink. A number of these things we can already see in the Lovell Health House, the one we just took a look at, but it's also going to be, they're also going to inform another house that Neutra is going to design, certainly his most famous one, which is the Kaufman Desert House in Palm Springs, California, from the period immediately following World War II. Now, this is not on the monuments list, and I'm not going to get into it in any great depth, but I believe that some of the images that you're looking at now will be familiar to you, or will be familiar to you. And we can just look at this as another example of Neutra's biorealism applied to architectural design. So a particular approach to this modern architecture informed by physiology and also psychology. Another early modernist that we can take a look at is Giuseppe Terragni, this time a young Italian designer who's going to find ways to take some of the ideas that we've already encountered and adapt them in a particular way to the context of Italy. Terragni was the son of a contractor, and so he grew up surrounded by the building trades. And he studied architecture at the Technical Institute in Milan. So he did not have a classical Beaux-Arts training in architecture. Rather, he was focused more on the technical aspects of architectural design. He formed a pretty close association with other students at the Technical Institute, and together they ended up being the initial promoters of this new post-World War II rationalism in Italy. They wrote a series of manifestos, which were kind of provocative statements intended to get people's attention and to make them aware of what it was that they saw as architecture's potential. They edited a number of journals, they organized a number of exhibits, and in all of these ways, they opened Italy up to this new post-World War I rational modernism. Terragni was also a convinced member of the fascist party in Italy at a point in time in which he might not have been able to predict the outcome of the fascist agenda. But through his associations, he ended up getting the commission for the Casa del Fascio in Como, which was going to be the headquarters of the local chapter of the fascist party. Now, one of the qualities that we're going to see in this building that Terragni quite specifically wanted to incorporate is transparency. Now, we've already seen that for Gropius, transparency meant one thing. For Gropius, transparency was all about new concepts of space and time and how they can be found in architecture. For Terragni, on the other hand, there was something more specific related to the user of the building. The history of fascism in Italy is connected to the political rise of Benito Mussolini. And initially, as a politician, Mussolini and the party that he formed, they really didn't have much of a political program other than being anti-establishment. They saw the different political parties as they existed. They saw the long histories that they had. They saw all of the political theory. And Mussolini and his party were much more focused on solving problems, not so much on the ideas. They knew that they wanted to be nationalistic. They knew that they wanted to be open to all Italians. But other than that, they were just there to buck the system, essentially. However, Mussolini came to power, and it was at that point that he realized that there needed to be some ideas that were going to guide their decisions, that were going to define the party and express what the party stood for. In an important talk that Mussolini gave to the leading authorities in Milan, a talk dating to 1929, he said, quote, in translation, he said, "Fascism is a house of glass that all can and should look into," unquote. A house of glass that all can and should look into. And what Terragni is going to do here is quite consciously try to find an architectural expression for that statement. So when we take a look at the building, we're going to see a structural grid that we can often look through. Sometimes we can look through the grid and see the sky or the hills behind it. Sometimes we can look at the exterior walls of different spaces. Sometimes the grid is covered over by stone revetment. But we also see him using glass in a very particular way. On the inside of the building, there is a glass-covered courtyard. That means that there's a lot of natural light pouring into the building. And then at ground level, we can see that there is a series of glass doors that provide access to the building and an open space going back into the courtyard. Now, often when we have glass in a building, if it opens, if the glass is a window that illuminates a closed interior space, the glass will appear dark and it will appear to be a void. But in this particular case, where the glass opens into an interior space that is lit with that skylight, it doesn't appear to be a void. It doesn't appear to be just a blank surface. We can see through the glass and into the space. And so by having a brightly illuminated interior space, the glass becomes completely transparent and it becomes something that we look through, not just a blank, not just a dark surface, not just a void, but actually looking into the building itself, all made possible by the glass creating that skylight. And so Terragni saw this specifically as a project that was intended to give architectural form to that political transparency. And Terragni, in his own statement, again translated from Italian, said, quote, "This building is an architectural interpretation that is the complement of that metaphor." Mussolini gave the metaphor of glass house. Here he's giving an architectural interpretation of that metaphor. Terragni continued, "No encumbrance, no barrier, no obstacle between the political hierarchy and the people." And that's what Terragni was hoping to achieve here for this particular building. Plus, there was the notion of populism that was always at the root of Mussolini's political career and the fascism that he was promoting, a connection between the party and the government and the people. And that's accommodated here in some ways by the glass doors that line up along a part of the facade of the building and that provide access into the interior spaces and into that interior courtyard. Those glass doors are operated mechanically, and so at a certain point, with a flip of the switch, all of them are going to open. And that could have a role to play in the stagecraft that is politics. We can imagine a group of fascists together in the courtyard at a meeting, and then at a certain point in the meeting, the doors mechanically open, allowing them all to go out into the city, perhaps even giving notice about when it was time to go out into the city, giving a signal to leave and to go out into the city. And so there was a political program for the building that was accomplished in a couple of different architectural ways. Now, Terragni, as I mentioned, was one of a group of young designers that was very much interested in this new sort of post-World War I rationalism. And here we're taking a look at the courtyard, and you can see all of the doors and the connection, and you can imagine those doors opening mechanically and opening out. So, again, Terragni was aware of what was happening in Western Europe, but he seemed particularly interested in Le Corbusier. The connections, the parallels between his architecture and Le Corbusier's architecture there are a number of connections between the two. But there are also some points that Le Corbusier was making in his treatise that seem to be important for Terragni's architecture. Le Corbusier made clear that there were some basic principles from the past that should be incorporated into this new rationalist modernism. And like Le Corbusier, Terragni also had to deal with the past. Now, maybe this is inevitable, considering that he's in Italy, where the architectural legacy is so strong and felt so palpably. But Terragni's also going to look for some basic principles, some basic ideas from the past that can inform a rational modern architecture without being a slavish recreation of history. Interestingly, during the same period of time, in the exact same years that Terragni was designing the Casa del Fascio, he also received the commission for 2 mausolea in the civic cemetery in Como. Not large buildings, but 2 family mausolea located within this larger cemetery. When we take a look at both of them, which face each other across a street that runs through the cemetery, a sort of street in quotation marks there, it's obvious that they have a relation to the classical tradition. There are some basic classical principles at play. There is a use of geometry in both of these that draws upon the classical tradition. One of them has some classical details. The other has very, very few classical details. But it's clear that in the same period of time that Terragni's focused on designing the Casa del Fascio, he's not entirely disassociated himself with classical architectural history. He's certainly reinterpreting it, certainly doing some things that were a bit unusual, but he's not entirely dissociated from it. We're going to see that same attitude towards history in the design of the Casa del Fascio. First of all, if we take a look at the planning, the building is organized around an interior courtyard. In the Casa del Fascio, it is skylit. Skylit because you can skylight it. You've got the modern materials, the modern structure, the modern technology, the glass that's available to cover the courtyard with glass. But the planning of the building, the typology of the building, is very much like a Renaissance palazzo. On the right, we're taking a look at a couple of views of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, a palazzo from the 16th century or the 1500s. And you can see it appears to be a building block organized around an interior courtyard. Similarly, the Casa del Fascio draws upon that palace typology in order to create a seat of authority, in this case not for a family, but rather for the political party in Como. When we take a look at the Casa del Fascio, we can very clearly see the structural system laid out on this grid. I think it's clear by these images here. I don't know what else I could say about it. But we can see a point load system, in this case of pour-in-place reinforced concrete, laid out very regularly and also expressed on the outside of the building. Again, allowing transparency in a whole variety of different ways, but we can see that grid. That grid was conceived of not only in terms of what the structure and the technology and the materials can accomplish, but also in terms of the proportional relationship to the larger whole. And it's that relationship of length to width to height and of breadth to height within the openings of the building. It's those proportional relationships that also tie it back to the classical past. In classical architecture, there were proportional systems that were expressed through the architectural orders. And then within each particular building, there were proportional relationships between the parts to the whole. And those proportions were often conceived of and expressed in terms of some basic geometry. And so what we see Terragni doing here is a modern architecture in the materials, in the structural systems, in the technology, in the lack of ornamentation on the building. But there still are a couple basic principles from the classical past, typology and proportion, that he's bringing into the design of the building. And so the building itself becomes an essay in solid versus void, and the development of the windows and the framed views into and out of the building that really becomes the architectural component for the design of the building. It's all covered in thin stone revetment, but it does not appear to be a massive material. It all appears to be some thin materials that are applied onto this structural system and that allow the geometry to be very clearly seen on the building. So it's a modern composition with no ornament, and this was Terragni's essay in what this new post-World War I rational architecture should be in Italy, where they can't get away from the architectural history. The war broke out World War II broke out in 1939 after this building was largely completed. And Terragni was sent to the Eastern Front, where in a couple of years he experienced some of the difficulties of the war, and because he suffered in his health as well as his mental well-being because of the war, he was shipped back from the front and sent home and died in somewhat mysterious circumstances in Italy in 1943. And so we're not going to be able to follow Terragni's career beyond this. But here we're taking a look at what he felt was a post-World War I rationalism that was appropriate for Italy. One of the important events in the definition of this post-World War I rationalism is going to be an exhibit that was held at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932. The Museum of Modern Art was a relatively new institution, and Philip Johnson is going to be one of the important contributors to the development of the institution. He's also going to be one of the organizers of the exhibit that we're going to look at, along with Henry Russell Hitchcock. Of the images that we see here, to the left you can see the cover of the catalog for the exhibit, which I'll be quoting from in today's lecture. And we can also see photographs first of Philip Johnson and then of Henry Russell Hitchcock. Hitchcock was an architectural historian who was interested in charting these new developments in post-World War I rationalism. Johnson came from a wealthy family and starting his studies in philosophy, he's eventually going to turn to study architecture and become a practicing architect as well. But before his studies, before his formal training, and before his practice, he's going to take the family money and found the architecture department of the Museum of Modern Art. And so this institution, which is going to showcase and feature some of the work of new painters and sculptors, all of a sudden now has an architecture department because of Johnson's money. And not surprisingly, Johnson became the first director of the architecture department at the Museum of Modern Art. In the early 1930s, he and Hitchcock are interested in organizing this exhibit. And so together they travel to Western Europe for a period of time. They look at the buildings. They meet some of the designers that we've already looked at in class lecture. They come back to New York and they organize this exhibit. If we take a look at the table of contents for the catalog for the exhibit, we can see that there's some introductory information and a few different essays that define modernism and that give credit to the different contributors. But we're also going to see the list of architects that they have here. Some of them, when we think about post-World War I rationalism, shouldn't surprise us. Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, right? The people that we're expecting. But we can also see Frank Lloyd Wright here. Now, this might be a little surprising. If we think back to the designs of Wright that we've previously looked at in class lecture, you might think that they are significantly different than the early work of Le Corbusier or Mies or of Gropius, right? They just look different, right? They don't have the basic geometry expressed the same way. There's a lot more detailed historical materials as well as what could be considered modern materials, right? Wright just doesn't look the same as these other guys. And Johnson and Hitchcock acknowledge that in their introduction. And I'll quote at length what they had to say about Frank Lloyd Wright. In this exhibition, international modernism is illustrated by the work of its leading exponents in Europe and in America. One very great architect, however, is included who is not intimately related to the style, although his early work was one of the style's most important sources. The catalog explains how fundamental was Frank Lloyd Wright's influence upon important Dutch architects. The Germans, Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, also seem to have studied his work at some point in their careers. But Wright, while he does not precisely disown these architectural nephews, he remains what he has always been, a passionately independent genius whose career is a history of original discovery and contradiction. While he was much older than the other architects in the exhibition, his role is not merely that of, quote, pioneer ancestor, unquote. As the embodiment of the romantic principle of individualism, Wright's work, complex and abundant, remains a challenge to the austerity of the style of his best younger contemporaries, unquote. So Johnson and Hitchcock make the connection. They acknowledge the fact that Wright is going to be influential for the others, and so they're going to include him here. And in class lecture, we've seen how his experimentation with breaking down traditional configurations of space was going to have such a profound influence on the De Stijl architects, on early Gropius, on early Mies, right? So that's acknowledged here. But this isn't an exhibit about Frank Lloyd Wright. This is an exhibit about the early modernists. And Johnson and Hitchcock, in their introductory essay, continue, quote, "The founders of the international style include Gropius, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. It happens that one of these is a Parisian of Swiss birth, and the other two Germans. Le Corbusier is perhaps the greatest theorist, the most erudite and the boldest experimenter. Gropius the most sociologically minded, Mies van der Rohe the most luxurious and elegant. These masters prove not only the internationalism of the style, but also the wide personal variations possible within what may seem at first glance a restricted range of possibilities. So they organize the exhibit in terms of the production of different designers. But in taking a look at them, and also in sort of distilling some of the basic principles, they're going to provide us with a definition of international modernism that we're going to use as we move forward in the class. They're going to define international modernism's principles and also its qualities. So let's start with the principles. The principles that they identify are technically advanced and utilitarian. By technically advanced, they're talking about the materials and the structure of the building. Okay? Technically advanced. By utilitarian, they mean modern requirements dictate the planning. Modern requirements dictate the planning. Okay? So utilitarian. Technically advanced and utilitarian. Those are the basic principles. When we move on to the qualities of international modernism, I'm going to illustrate them by comparing and contrasting a couple of different buildings that were completely contemporary one with the other. One is going to be the Nebraska State Capitol by the American designer Cram, which is located in Lincoln, Nebraska, and dates to the 1920s. And the other is the Bauhaus Academy, designed by Gropius in Dessau, also from the 1920s. So two buildings that are exactly contemporary with each other, but that are going to allow me to do a little comparison and contrast as a way of illustrating the qualities of international modernism as defined by Johnson and Hitchcock. The first of those qualities, volume, not mass. Okay, volume, not mass. If we take a look at the images to the left, the Nebraska State House, we're going to see the way that stone is built up in the building. We've got these different stone-clad volumes that appear to be bracing each other and supporting some of the corners of the building. We know that stone is a heavy material. It can be thin revetment, it can be thick blocks, chunky blocks of rusticated stone, but we know it's going to be heavy. But here, the way that it's used on the building and the way that it is expressed as masses that are just accumulated is a way of expressing the weight and the support for the building. Okay, so that's an expression of mass. If, on the other hand, we take a look at this view of the Bauhaus Academy, we can see an exterior surface of the building that is transparent or that appears to be thin and lightweight, and that is supported by an interior structural system that is a point load structural system. Okay, specifically, we're looking at curtain wall around the workshop wing of the Bauhaus Academy. But you can see that these thin modern materials are enclosing volume. They're not trying to look massive. So here we've got one comparison contrast that I hope is going to really explain what volume, not mass, means. The second quality is regularity and flexibility, not symmetry or tripartite design. Okay, regularity and flexibility. If we take a look at the Nebraska State House, we can see central axis, symmetry about the axis, tripartite design. Indeed, this is one of those great examples of stripped classicism that was becoming popular in the 19 teens, 1920s, and that was being used for government architecture around the world. But we can see a few basic classical principles in the way the building is laid out and in the way it's designed in 3 dimensions. If we take a look at the Bauhaus Academy, on the other hand, there is no symmetry. There is no tripartite design. That doesn't mean that it's chaos, right? There is regularity, and the regularity comes from the basic geometry of the individual parts of the building, as well as regular floor-to-floor heights, regular sizes and shapes to the openings that depend on the size and shape of materials coming out of the factory, right? So there's a lot of regularity here, even though they're intentionally avoiding symmetry and tripartite design. If we take a look at other illustrations from the catalog, we can see other examples of that regularity, right? Again, the basic geometry, and then the way that the openings and the massing is organized on the building, right? Regularity, not symmetry. And then the third quality is going to be technical perfection and proportion, not historical ornament or pattern. Okay? Technical perfection and proportion, not historical ornament or pattern. Okay. If we take a look at the illustrations of the Nebraska State House, we can see that there was a lot of detail on the building. A lot of it is sort of 20th century American reinterpretations of classical detailing. Instead of acanthus leaves, they may use tobacco leaves. Instead of acanthus capitals, they may use corn. As things typically American, right? But still, details drawn from history. If we take a look, on the other hand, at the Bauhaus, we can see that there is absolutely no historical detail on the building. There's no decoration on the building. The only detail is what is required to hold the building together, right? And for the assemblies on the building. But it's there that we can see the technical perfection. Okay, specifically if we look at the curtain wall on the Bauhaus, we can see this assembly that has been perfected in its details and executed extremely well. Right? Technical perfection. Proportion is something that is going to continue throughout architecture from the classical past. And they might also have said proportion and geometry. They didn't, but we can understand the proportion as being the width to height relationship in any of the individual geometric forms that we can see in the building. And perhaps, like we've seen on the Casa del Fascio, a relationship of the parts to the whole. Okay? So here we have what Johnson and Hitchcock are identifying as the crucial characteristics of international modernism. Volume, regularity and flexibility, technical perfection, and proportion. In class lecture, I might present this as in a shorthand way and say volume, not mass, regularity, not symmetry, no historical detail. But in terms of the full definition, here we've got it. These are the qualities that Johnson and Hitchcock defined as the crucial qualities of this new post-World War I rationalism that they're calling international modernism. Now, this is going to be a somewhat controversial architectural movement in the 1920s and in the 1930s. In the 1920s, we can see plenty of examples of stripped classicism for government purposes. We've already seen the Nebraska State House. If we take a look at the Stockholm Public Library in Sweden, we can see stripped classicism for a democratic form of government. In the 20s and 30s, as we see the rise of authoritarianism and fascism around the world, we're going to see that some of those regimes also adopted strict classicism for some of their government commissions. On the right, we can take a look at a building that was commissioned for a World's Fair that Mussolini's government was going to sponsor, which was supposed to be opened outside of Rome in 1942. The war intervened. They never actually had the World's Fair, but there were a number of buildings that were built. And if we look at it, we can see a great example of strict classicism. In Italy, the fascist government of Mussolini was tolerant of modernist architecture. We've seen the Casa del Fascio, which was for a local chapter of the Fascist Party, and there were other buildings that the Fascist Party promoted that are modernist in their design. But the fascist government in Italy is also going to focus on tradition and architectural history. The left two images are important to understand the residential architecture that Mussolini's fascist government is going to promote. On the bottom of the left, you can see a vernacular example of a farmhouse outside of Rome. And then on the upper left, you can see housing that Mussolini's government sponsored in the urban expansion of the city of Rome. And you can see examples of domestic architecture that very clearly draw from that vernacular tradition. And so tradition and history is going to be important for the fascist government in Italy. For projects that were more closely associated with Mussolini himself, we're going to see a sort of strict classicism being used. And in the images to the right, we can see buildings that were built as part of Mussolini's urban redevelopment of the city of Rome, buildings that were going to be very closely associated with him as the dictator of Italy, and buildings that very clearly show a sort of a strict classicism in their design. In fascist Germany, there is going to be no toleration of modernist art or modernist architecture. Hitler was an amateur artist, and he felt that he knew enough about art and architecture to have some very clear ideas about them. And he was going to promote tradition and classicism in his commissions, quite to the detriment of modernist painters, modernist sculptors, and modernist architects. In the lower two images, we can see examples of the art that was being commissioned for the Nazi Party. Obviously, they are promoting Hitler and Hitler's military agenda. But beyond that, we see very traditional roles for the different sexes. We can see a traditional way of life. And we can also see art that is figurative and representative, and that uses some of the principles and techniques of the long legacy of Renaissance art as it had arrived into the 1900s. This is going to be the art that Hitler is going to promote. And he's going to criticize modern painting and sculpture, largely through an exhibit that was held in 1937 that was going to do a bit of comparison and contrast. In the central top image there, you can see the cover of the exhibit catalog. And to the right in that image, you can see an example of modern sculpture, beneath which you see the German word Kunst, which means art. And you can also see that it's in quotation marks, as if some people consider this to be art. In the exhibit itself, and to the right, we can see a couple of different images from the exhibit. What they did was to put on display traditional art and contrast it with modern art, some of which had been confiscated from different individuals. And the whole point was that this modern art was, first of all, bad art. It didn't live up to the expectations of the value of Western art. And furthermore, they associated it very closely with communists and with Jewish people. And so for all of these reasons, it was not promoted by the Nazis. And as a matter of fact, the artists themselves, as well as the people who commissioned art from them, were going to be persecuted by the Nazi regime. This is also going to extend through to architecture. And Hitler had some very clear ideas about the appropriate architecture for Nazi Germany, and it was going to be stripped classicism, albeit stripped classicism at an enormous scale. Consequently, those who promoted modernist architecture, those who practiced modernist architecture, were going to be persecuted by the Nazis. Let's talk about what happened to the Bauhaus a little bit in the 1930s. Walter Gropius stepped down from his directorship at the Bauhaus, and Mies van der Rohe is going to take over. In 1933, the Nazis, who were firmly in power by that point, are going to move the national capital back to Berlin. You may recall in class lecture that I mentioned that the post-World War I government had moved the capital away from Berlin because they wanted to disassociate themselves from the militaristic and imperialistic overtones of Berlin. But the Nazis moved it back to Berlin because they're going to embrace militarism. They're going to embrace imperialism. And so they moved back to Berlin. Mies, in direction of the Bauhaus, understood that the cultural program of the Nazis was not going to be particularly favorable to the Bauhaus, the faculty, the students who were going to be graduating, nor to the educational curriculum or the art and architecture that was coming out of the Bauhaus. But in Mies's mind, they weren't doing anything wrong. So what he decided to do was to move the Bauhaus Academy to Berlin as a way of demonstrating their loyalty to the German government. So they moved to Berlin, they opened up shop there, and they weren't in operation for very long before a gang of Nazi thugs breaks in and basically ransacks the place. And it's at that point that Mies realizes that this is not going to be a place for modernist designers. The Nazi regime is not going to leave them at peace to do what they do. And as a matter of fact, they're going to be persecuted. And so, in the 1930s, we can see a lot of these modernist designers emigrating out of Germany and to different locations, including to the United States. Now, I do not want you to copy this down, but I want you to take a look at this and just understand what was happening in the 20s and in the 30s. We see a number of Europeans who know and understand and practice modernism who emigrate to the United States. We've already seen Richard Neutra, who emigrated to the United States in 1923. In the lecture on skyscrapers, which is coming up in a couple of class meetings, we'll take a look at William Lescaz, who emigrated from Switzerland to the United States in 1920. They brought some basic modernist ideas with them and began practicing modernism in the United States. But with the rise of the Nazis in Germany and with their cultural program and with their persecution of modernist designers, we're going to see a lot of designers and a lot of modernist architects leaving Nazi Germany. There's a list here of which in this class we only focus on two, Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. Gropius fled to Britain in 1934, and he eventually came to the United States in 1937. Mies also emigrated to the United States in 1937. And particularly for Gropius and Mies, when they show up in the United States, they practice architecture, but they are offered teaching positions. Gropius at Harvard, Mies at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And so they end up educating generations of young Americans about modernist architecture. When Gropius showed up at Harvard, they were still teaching according to the Beaux-Arts system. And very quickly, Gropius is going to change the entire curriculum from a classical curriculum to a modernist curriculum. And so at Harvard, they began teaching young designers modernist architecture. Mies in Chicago at the Illinois Institute of Technology similarly is going to begin teaching modernism. When we take a look at post-World War I rationalism, by and large, we're looking at a European phenomenon that has to be brought to the United States. And the three ways in which it was brought to the United States was, first of all, through emigration. We've seen in the 20s and the 30s, modernist designers, with their training, with their understanding, emigrate to the United States and bring with them modernist design. Secondly, we've got the exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art that Johnson and Hitchcock organized. They showed Americans what modernist architecture in Europe was like, and they educated Americans about it through the catalog. They gave it a title, they described it. That's one way in which modernist architecture was brought to the United States. And then thirdly, through education, specifically with Gropius and Mies teaching, generations of young American architects are learning about modernism, and then they go on to practice modernism. So we've seen things come together in a particular way in post-World War I Europe. We've seen it defined and explained in the exhibit. And moving forward, we're going to take a look in this class at how architects defined and how they reinterpreted international modernism and how in their careers they developed upon it. And that is going to be the backbone for much of the rest of this class.